Hi, everybody. Thanks again for whomever is staying with us from the previous workshops. I just want to welcome you for being with us here today, and for whomever is joining us right now and online, thank you for watching these workshops with us. It's an important day to celebrate, and you include education and celebration and service with us today. I wanted to introduce our distinguished faculty member who is going to be presenting on ethical dissent and militant nonviolence, foundations of the civil rights movements. Please give a round of applause to Keith Knutson. Thank you.
Generally, I'd speak without a microphone. I think you can hear me? Yeah. Oh, but for the, you're not the only audience out there. Okay, so I'll stick with this. Do you have a microphone? Okay, this might be better for me. In relationship to the discussion that just was had, I'm doing this presentation. Let me figure out how to move forward. The great dissenter is John Marshall Harlan. He was a United States Supreme Court Justice, 1877 to 1911 or 12. When I came to La Crosse in 1969 to attend LSU, not Louisiana State, but La Crosse State University, my roommate was a black guy from the south side of Chicago, Albert Grace, and he attended Harlan High School. His high school was named after the protagonist in my presentation. He and I were roommates for a couple years, and one of the things I experienced with him at a football game was one of the, what do we call them, fraternities. A bunch of fraternity guys came over to the section of the football stadium where I was sitting with my roommate, and I think there were maybe 40, perhaps 50 black students at LSU or UWL at the time, and what ensued was a brawl. Natural-born coward that I am, tall, skinny white guy that I was still, well, not so skinny anymore, I was able to slip away and not get pummeled. But by the time my roommate got back to our room, it was pretty evident that he had taken some blows and his clothes were pretty roughed up. So the last question that the people addressed, have things picked up a little bit here? I haven't heard of any brawls, but I experienced one in 1969, and that was quite a wake-up call for me. Race relations in this town have an interesting history, one that I'm not going to deal with, but I think the previous panel gets us to think about how are we grappling with this foundational issue in our society. All right, so about a year and a half ago, I had a special birthday party, and one of the birthday gifts was a friend of mine giving me this biography of John Marshall Harlan. As a member of the United States Supreme Court, he is historically known for his dissents, that is, his opinions in dissent to the majority of the Supreme Court decisions, and often he was the lone dissenter. Already there were 9 justices on the Supreme Court, so 8-1 decisions, and John Marshall Harlan didn't go along with the majority, and I think that's a foundational element of looking at our civil rights movement as I'm looking around the room as we white Americans engage this topic. How much courage is it going to require to stand up to injustice? And this man had it, and his biography gives us an interesting contribution to understanding where that courage came from, where what I'm called in the title ethical dissent comes from, and then rather briefly at the end of the presentation, I'll look at that nonviolent foundation for the civil rights movement. Here's where Harlan was born, 1832. Family home in Kentucky. Kentucky was the first new state to enter the Union in 1792. Many of the settlers had come from either Virginia or maybe the Carolinas, bringing their slaves with them, and that was the case with the Harlan family. this home no longer stands. Unfortunately, like many of our historical buildings, this town can witness to that, taken down before its time, perhaps. My protagonist, John, was the sixth child, fifth son, born to this couple. John was named after John Marshall Harlan, the third United States Supreme Court Chief Justice, labeled great in the slide, still today considered probably our greatest Supreme Court justice. Famous decisions that I won't deal with, but for John Marshall Harlan, John Marshall set out the foundation for the central government to have a legal foundation for protecting the construction of the Union against what still today might be called states' rights. And I won't go into the American government foundation of a constitutional construction out of the Articles of Confederation, where the individual states ran their own show and there really was no United States of America. John Marshall Harlan then is going to be deeply influenced by this foundation of how to maintain the Union. A question, we'll all have our own opinions, but in mine, a question that still we as Americans can address in the current political climate we face today. Kentucky's greatest politician, probably in its entire history, Henry Clay, John Marshall Harlan's, I'm going to call him JMH from here on out so that I don't keep repeating the name. The elder Harlan was a close political ally of this gentleman. And what our protagonist then, JMH, really learned was the necessity of maintaining the Union. And of course, we're moving in the direction in this presentation of covering the Civil War rather briefly. Oops, sorry. Now, somewhere in the late 1830s in the Harlan family in Kentucky, Robert Harlan showed up, a black slave from Virginia. Probably, this can't be proven or disproven, but probably the actual son of John Marshall Harlan's father. In these days, it was a custom for teenage boys to go through a rite of passage in slaveholding families, everyone in the room, but especially females, to rape one of their female slaves. And the speculation is that Robert Harlan then was the product of such a social rite of passage. He made his way from Virginia, where he was born, and we know that the Harlan family came from Virginia, to Kentucky. And upon arrival, the father Harlan took Robert into the family. Now, when I teach U.S. history leading up to 1865, one of the things we learn in our textbook is that it was against the law to educate a black slave in a slave-holding state. I don't have the father Harlan had 200 private law books. He was an accomplished lawyer. What was he thinking? Taking his slave son to the school to get educated. Well, at the end of the first day, the school teacher brought Robert Harlan home and said, "Look, Mr. Harlan, this isn't going to happen. You know as well as anybody else, we don't educate black children in our community." And so Robert Harlan, fortunately for himself, had some remarkable skills. Of course, the Harlans were growing up in the Kentucky bluegrass region, pretty close to Lexington, Kentucky Derby, all that sort of thing, much later on. Robert Harlan knew horses. He also was a remarkably self-confident human being, which is remarkable in itself for a slave upbringing, or at least being born a slave. Robert Harlan became a riverboat gambler. He started to own horses, and he even had some of his own horses racing the white establishment in Kentucky. But then the California Gold Rush comes along in 1849, and Robert Harlan decides he's going to make his fortune, so he catches a riverboat to New Orleans, from New Orleans to Panama, crosses the Panama Isthmus before the canal, for many people a death sentence, catches a boat up to San Francisco. He doesn't end up in the field panning for gold. He started a store. And by the time he comes home, he's worth $90,000, and this is 1850. And that is a bunch of money. Robert Harlan, the slave-born member of the Harlan family, is the most financially accomplished of all the Harlan brothers. He moves to Cincinnati, of course, one of the stops on the Underground Railroad, getting out of slave-controlled territory. Robert starts to buy up some property. Here's a hotel. Doesn't quite look quite as fancy as in the painting of the previous slide. But Robert Harlan then is on a course for financial accomplishment. And he does maintain a relationship with JMH throughout their lives. And we'll see that later on, Robert Harlan, the slave child, is going to be a very important actor in John Marshall Harlan's professional career. Robert Harlan is the first American to take his own horses across the Atlantic and start racing against the English aristocrats. And so he begins to get a flavor of living a life. Look, Britain has its own racial problems. Let's not idealize the circumstance. But he gets into England and he starts mixing with the English racing crowd. He even gets an apartment that the white members of his family might have been quite envious of if they had ever gone to England to reside and stay a while. Robert Harlan does that basically during the Civil War. Now JMH, during the Civil War, he joins the Union military. So there are 4 slaveholding states that do not join the Confederacy: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. And so Harlan then joins the Union Army, engages in military activity that I won't burden us with this morning, but he does fight for the Union, and of course, coming out of that John C. Calhoun legacy is dedicated to preserving the Union as opposed to compromising the Union with the rights of slaveholding. And again, keep in mind, the Harlan family had owned just a handful of slaves. Not trying to apologize for them, but they weren't big-time influential plantation owners. During the Civil War then, as the Attorney General for Kentucky, John meets perhaps the greatest figure in American history in the 19th century, and that's saying something. When we've got Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt at the end of the century, start of the 20th. Historians today are arguing that here is the greatest American in that pivotal century for the maintenance of our Union, Frederick Douglass, an escaped slave. He becomes an advisor to Abraham Lincoln. In my estimation, Lincoln, the greatest president in our history. Of course, to achieve greatness, sometimes there needs to be dire circumstances to get through. Sometimes leaders will make their way through that successfully, and sometimes they'll fall on their faces. Lincoln, of course, fell at Ford's Theater, but John Wilkes Booth shot him in the back. Lincoln met with Frederick Douglass quite regularly, and Douglass helped Abraham Lincoln transform his attitude about race relations. January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation, and then, of course, before being killed, lobbying Congress to get the 13th Amendment passed through both houses of Congress and put to the states. And finally, in 1865, in December, one legacy of Abraham Lincoln, besides preserving the Union, is to have the 13th Amendment become the law of the land. That is, slavery is now constitutionally, in the basic law, unacceptable in the United States of America. Unless, well, I saw the Franciscan sisters were going to do a seminar on human trafficking, so we know that sex trafficking, we know that slavery is still part and parcel of private business affairs, but legally, slavery is unacceptable. There will be one more exception that I'll talk about as regards slavery in just a little bit. JMH got to know Frederick Douglass, and we'll see how close they became in their acquaintance a little bit later through the slideshow. So after the Civil War from 1865 to 76, if there's anyone here from U.S. History 112, we're going to spend a couple weeks looking at Reconstruction. Reconstruction runs in our country from 1865 to 76. How will the secessionist states be worked back into the Union? I'm not going to burden us with that one, but in 1876, there's a pivotal presidential election, and Reconstruction comes to an end out of the presidential election of 1876. It had been waning for some time, but details, well, if you're not registered for U.S. history yet, there's still time, I bet. In that year, the presidential convention, Rutherford B Hayes is nominated. JMH went into the convention favoring a favorite son from Kentucky named Bristow. Robert Harlan, now living in Ohio, where Hayes was the governor, Robert Harlan supported Hayes for the presidential nomination. Hayes gets the nomination. He wins the presidency in perhaps our most corrupted election in history, in our history. The probable supposed winner, the Democrat Tilden from governor of New York, counting ballots would have won the election, but electoral ballots might sound familiar if you've been following the attempted insurrection on January 1, 2021, and the shenanigans of former President Trump and his insurrectionist allies trying to change electoral college votes. Fortunately, unsuccessful in our last presidential election. Votes in the South, Louisiana, Florida, Georgia, should have gone to the Democrat. They went to the Republican, and Rutherford B Hayes becomes President of the United States. His bargain with those Southern electors, vote for me, and the Union troops will be pulled out of the South, and Reconstruction then will come to an end, and Southern states will now be untethered to engage in their behavior towards a large segment of their population that had been slaves, and I think it's safe to say most white folks in the South would have preferred to keep it that way. We won't get into the debate now, but only people who are utterly ill-informed on history try to argue that the Civil War was something about anything other than slavery. And Southerners, those surviving, how badly did the South want to retain slavery? 1 out of every 4 Southern white men of military age perished in the Civil War. And we're not going to cover what comes afterward, except in a very perfunctory way. But now with Hayes, the North has given up any effort to reconstruct the Southern states and dictate to them, how are you going to be treating your former slave population? Now, of course, the 14th Amendment, anyone born on our territory a citizen, ratified in 1868, specifically to ensure that freed men, because of course some sort of report females in the room, it was all about men still, freed men would be citizens. And then of course the 15th Amendment ratified in 1870, ensuring that those freed men would have the right to vote. Those 3 Civil War amendments, well, I think what John Marshall Harlan, when we get to him on the Supreme Court, is saying, the United States Supreme Court is going to refuse to enforce the Constitution of the United States of America. And that is a foundational element of our history and one we still have to grapple with. Harlan and Hayes are acquaintances. Harlan had brought the Kentucky delegation around at the convention to support Hayes for the nomination. And Harlan is going to begin to build up a political relationship with the President of the United States. And one way he's going to do it is through his brother, Robert. And in 1877 then, his black brother, Robert, an active black member of the Republican Party, well, you can read articles today about African American peoples in either the Democratic or Republican Party. I'll leave that to your reading for today, in today's news media. But Robert then lobbied for his brother John to be nominated by President Hayes, and then, of course, the Senate would confirm that nomination, and destiny fulfilled. Why did JMH's father name him John Marshall Harlan? Because the father felt he could be destined to serve on the United States Supreme Court, which, of course, now, destiny being fulfilled. At this time, Robert Harlan in Ohio was running for a seat to serve in the United States Congress, and there were some number of African American members of the United States Congress, one black senator out of the South. Reconstruction is going to take a while to wind down, and so black men are still going to be involved in politics. But here we get a bit of a prophet. I don't know if you're going to the, I hope you're going to the session tonight with our speaker, Andre Johnson. He was here about a decade ago. His speech 10 years ago was about Martin Luther King as a prophet. Here, this guy is kind of being a prophet. The Republican Party, which had championed the rights of freedmen, is now drawing back from that commitment. And freed men, and then women and their children, black human beings, especially in the southern former Confederate slaveholding states, they're going to be left to fend for themselves in a society that is violence-oriented, to say the least, if we learn anything about our southern history during slavery and now post-Reconstruction as we move along. One of the first developments is here in New York City, a black man is refused a seat at a theater. And the Supreme Court, with Harlan on it, gets this case, and now Harlan begins his career as the great dissenter. That is, 8 justices say, this is okay. Black people can be discriminated against. Segregation can be part and parcel of this society, and the lone dissenter, which I won't go through all those cases, there are quite a few, is John Marshall Harlan, and thus the title of the biography I read, The Great Dissenter. In addition to the U.S. Supreme Court ducking its responsibility to enforce the Constitution of the United States of America, Southern states began to pass laws, some of them called pig laws. If someone stole a pig worth $3, the person would be convicted on a felony charge, and then prisoners from roughly 1880 until about almost 1940. 200,000 black men got caught up in the Southern states' convict leasing program. 40,000 of them were worked to death. Here's where we get the foundation of the modern American prejudice. I don't know, I got into the session late with the students previous to this, but of course one of our white prejudices against black Americans is that they're criminals. Here now we see that socially contrived construction in the South so that capitalists, business people, can get labor perhaps even cheaper than when black men were slaves. Now these convicts are worth so little that, again, 40,000 of them died in these horrible conditions, and I won't try to describe them. If you're at all interested in following up, students in U.S. history, you're going to watch a movie, a documentary entitled Slavery by Another Name. But for anyone else, I recommend it. It's quite a disturbing element of our history. From 1890 till 1920, every 3 to 5 days, a black person was lynched in this country. Here's one example of it. We have this photograph. You might see a body hanging from the bridge on the left, and then you see another body hanging from the bridge on the right. On the right is the mother. On the left is her son. And why do we have this photograph? A professional photographer was hired. The people who perpetrated the lynching made a postcard, and they sent their behavior to their friends and their families, because for many people this was maintaining social stability. So they were proud of this. Once again, I apologize to females in the room, but my U.S. history text tells us that the mother hanging was serially raped in front of her own son before these men lynched her from this bridge. And so here's this tradition in our society of maintaining social mores and civility. And of course, later on, that's going to be turned around again, but we'll get there. Frederick Douglass died in 1895, and only 2 white politicians attended his funeral. What kind of relationship had JMH built up with Frederick Douglass? This Supreme Court justice and then a senator from Ohio. The only 2 white guys to attend the funeral procession of what today, more than 100 years later, many historians are saying was the greatest figure in our entire 19th century history. Society has a way of, I suppose, changing its attitudes, fortunately, for some of the atrocious behavior I've already put on display here. Well, here's the Supreme Court case that John Marshall Harlan is most known for, and if my college roommate attending Harlan High School, the high school was probably named for Harlan after this particular case. Homer Plessy, a 1/8 black man in New Orleans, bought a full fare train ticket. When he went to get on the train and sit in the passenger car, the conductor named Ferguson refused to seat him. And so African American peoples buying full fare train tickets, where did they sit? In the cattle car? The United States Supreme Court then comes up with the judicial philosophy of separate but equal. That is, people can be separated out premised upon skin color, but of course the court, anyone who knows me may know that I use some foul words every once in a while, but I think it's quite appropriate now. Members of the United States Supreme Court were bullshitting themselves that they were engaged in setting out a doctrine of not just separation, but equality. I can appreciate Q's comment on what about equality in a society that has been so deeply constructed to be unequal in our a whole variety of social relationships. So in Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court rules, all right, separate but equal will be the law of the land. I won't read Harlan's dissent to you. we got started late, and in typical fashion, I'm going a little long. But that dissent in 1896 becomes a rallying cry for Americans in the 20th century, especially people like Martin Luther King, who we're honoring today, that a separate but equal is a fiction. And somehow, some way, the institutional apparatus of this society is going to have to be confronted with our hypocrisy, and somehow, some way, this system is going to have to be changed. African American people's testimonial to their allegiance to JMH, 5-cent cigars with his name on it. I'm not suggesting we celebrate with cigars anymore, but quite common in the 19th into the 20th century. Henry Billings was the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. I'm not going to spend too much time on his slide. He doesn't deserve much time. But Harlan maintained a cordial relationship with many of his fellow justices, people with whom he disagreed at his very core. And I think that's a lesson for us to try to digest today. How can we engage with people with whom we maybe don't even have respect? And it's become such a common social conundrum for us. But if we're going to address these concerns that are foundational to how we are able to live together in a prosperous and a fair and just society, well, Harlan, I think, shows us another good lesson on how to engage social transformation. This is an interesting case. In typical fashion, a black man was accused of raping a white woman, and the evidence showed that there was no way he could have been the perpetrator of the crime. The case comes to still today. Every night there's a Supreme Court justice on duty. We don't execute people in our society until at the very last minute, something like 11:58, a Supreme Court justice will review the case and say, okay, we can take this person out, and then at 12:03, 12:05, something like that, the person will be executed. John Marshall Harlan was on duty one night for the U.S. Supreme Court, and this case came out of Chattanooga, Tennessee. And Harlan read the brief and let it be known back in Chattanooga that he wanted the court to investigate this circumstance. And so the people of Chattanooga got word of that. The sheriff, conveniently, and all his staff are home for dinner one night, and residents in Chattanooga storm the jail, and they lynch the victim from this bridge. What comes out of it is a one-off experience for the United States Supreme Court. Harlan insisted on pursuing the sheriff who vacated his duty at the jail and allowed the community to lynch this accused rapist. And the only trial with criminal liability in the history of the United States Supreme Court would take place as a result of John Marshall Harlan pursuing this lynching episode in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Stephen Field was laissez-faire, let-do economics, that is, keep the government out of the way of entrepreneurial business people, and of course that came into race relations as well. And Harlan's dissents go beyond just race relations. An immigrant named Joseph Lochner, a baker, paying his people very little hourly wage, working them 14 hours a day, something like that. The case came to the Supreme Court, and once again, based upon this laissez-faire economics, the Supreme Court ruled 8-1. Mr. Lochner is exercising his freedom and his employees will have to exercise their own. Anyone in U.S. history will be looking at what's called liberty of contract. That is, workers cannot bind together in unions. They can't negotiate collectively with their employers. And for me, it'd be interesting to find out for you, is the lesson that segregation wasn't just for black people. It was, of course. But what's the lesson? We're all in this thing together. U.S. history students, you'll be watching a 4-part movie, America 1900. You'll learn about the Breaker Boys. 8, 9, 10-year-old boys who worked 12, 13, 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, probably dead by the time they're 21, 2 or 3, separating rock from coal on conveyor belts. Their hands would be brutalized day in and day out. This young girl, I think she's 12 years old, it's pretty evident that her body is maimed, and she too will experience an exceedingly diminished life. And so maybe, if anyone was here with Q, maybe one area I'd take a bit of a disagreement with him. We may not achieve equality, but if we don't aspire to it, well, I'm also teaching a class on the Holocaust this semester. And of course, what Germans learned was it wasn't just for Jews or people with disabilities or Roma people or socialist, communist, union workers, as one minister said. I thought it was all those people, and then they came for me. And of course, that's the lesson. We're in this thing together. And if we're all not equal, then we ourselves are unequal. How can we live with those denigrations, those diminishments, and of course, the diminishment of human life and the quality that we all aspire to achieve? So here's the quote. I think the only one I'll use from Harlan, but God bless this country, even if I'm not a believer in God. Somehow, some way, something bigger than ourselves is what we are about. And I wouldn't say our last great hope, but I think for us in our society, our hope is that we ourselves will try to get ourselves and our entire society to live up to the ideals that are the founding documents that set us on our course of being, as we see ourselves today, a world leader. The founders talked about an empire of freedom here in the United States. A bit of a contradictory term, but what is our destiny as Americans? John Marshall Harlan, I think, helps us think about what that should be. Today, Harlan's portrait is in the conference room in the United States Supreme Court. He may not be remembered in a wide social sense, but for the justices on the Supreme Court, when they go into conference to discuss their cases, this is the guy who's looking over them. Not John Marshall, the great Chief Justice, but rather John Marshall Harlan, the great dissenter. Here's the first black woman to serve on a federal court. If anyone wants to get these slides and read them more closely, I'd be happy to send this slideshow out, but I'm running out of time, so I'm going to keep moving along. The man in the center is Thurgood Marshall, the chief lawyer for the NAACP, and people working with him. I envision in this photograph they're marching to the United States Supreme Court to argue Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. John Marshall Harlan's dissent was the foundation of the unanimous opinion in the Supreme Court when Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, separate but equal, was overturned. In 1954, the United States Supreme Court ruled separate is inherently unequal. That's quite a legacy for JMH. How about, do things get better? Here's the son of Robert Harlan. He became a lawyer. One of the words I like in reading some books, he's described as erudite. That is, incredibly well-read, quite brilliant. He became a functionary, a bureaucrat in the United States government. But then in 1912, a raging bigot was elected president of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. The nation's capital became more deeply segregated than it has ever been in our history, at least since the Civil War. Harlan's positions began to diminish in government, and then in 1920s, the Republican Party became predominant from 1920 till 1932, and eventually Robert Harlan, an erudite lawyer, apparently, as we would say, good job reviews, ended his life driving a taxi. Here's the son of John Marshall Harlan. He got on the United States Supreme Court. I see the governor of Arkansas just somehow banned teaching critical race theory in the schools of Arkansas. I'm sure in grade schools and high schools nobody's teaching critical race theory. But why are people trying to prevent us from learning about the centrality of racism in our history, and as the students were telling us in the previous session, in our lives in a regular mix, on a regular basis? Well, there's got to be a reason. I guess I'd let Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the governor of Arkansas, try to explain to the nation why she thinks it's critical that schools not be able to teach something. I've read about critical race theory, John, you too, right? But you got to have a law degree to understand what's going on. It's only taught in law schools. But here's the racism that still pervades our society, and the intention of political leaders to play to the prejudices of people within our own society. So, militant nonviolence. Martin Luther King, we've had students go to Atlanta, Georgia, to the King Center and study the nonviolent agenda that the King Center still teaches on a very regular basis. But after going through the violence that previous slides held up, now how is it going to be overcome? And why might we think about the capacity of our own society to overcome such violent discrimination? Because this man is going to lead a militant, nonviolent protest. So what's going to happen to people? Police are going to attack them because they are standing up to the social conventions. Individual private citizens are going to use a staff with an American flag to try to impale a black person who is protesting segregation. Police officers are going to kick women when they're down because they are standing up for their rights, of course, getting knocked down in doing that. And in my estimation, the most elegant protest in the history, I think, of humankind. John Carlos and Tommy Lee. I wrote their names down. I always get it mixed up. I won't pull out my little note. Winning sprinting races in Mexico City in 1968, using their black gloves to protest racial discrimination in the United States. And here I think is the important point. These guys got sent home, but not by the United States Olympic Committee. They got sent home by the International Olympic Committee, which didn't want this kind of protest in its venue. These guys would have their medals taken away from them. Some of their lives would be diminished as a result of their protest. But here they are, not harming anyone, just expressing their consternation with the society that they will return to after having won gold and silver medals for our country. Dr. King, at the end of his career, marching with Benjamin Spock, protesting the Vietnam War. Here is where Dr. King had built up a political alliance with President Lyndon Baines Johnson. I get to teach a class on the Vietnam War. Interesting experience, having participated in that war. Now, Dr. King is going to go public against a war. I won't use the really bad words sometimes I use, but the Vietnam War, one of the greatest screw-ups in American history, ranking right up there with Afghanistan and Iraq. Bay of Pigs invasion, there are a few of them. And King then alienates the political establishment that he had built up an alliance with. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act. And then by 1968, protesting the war. Oh, even before that, 66, 67. King is vilified. Maybe any of you have read his letter from the Birmingham jail where he's asking Protestant ministers, hey, you're saying I'm going too far. Well, what about standing up for justice? What about not being violent? And of course, many more Protestant ministers would join in the civil rights movement after Dr. King's letter, written out of the jail in Birmingham after having been arrested for militant, nonviolent protest, trying to get us to live up to our constitutional order. Progress, yeah. Now that President Biden has caught up with classified documents, we'll see what happens. Well, there's already a special counsel. Barack Obama, two-term president, the only president not to be investigated by a special counsel in the last, I think, 3.5, maybe even 4 decades. And here I think it really comes home. It is our African American political leaders. Hakeem Jeffries, the leader of the Democrats in the House of Representatives. These are the people who need the Constitution of the United States to operate, and who's undermining it right now. Not African American peoples in the Democratic Party, white people in the Republican Party. And I think we need to get our heads squared on straight about how these things actually work in practicality. And until we do that, the young people on the panel and Q, and every one of us, because we are in it together, we run the risk of allowing this constitutional order to fall by the wayside if people are going to run, not exclusively, but still today, their racist agenda. Racist because people of a different color are not going to vote in the way that these white people in the Republican Party defending their traditional values. And what is one of those traditional values? Racism. Thank you for listening to me. I don't know what to do with this thing, Rahat.
Time for Q&A. If you want to stay a little bit longer, this is the time for Q&A. I'm going to hand you the mic so that the people watching live online can listen to your question too. So feel free to take a few minutes. We're going to take a couple of questions, and you can just raise your hand, and I'll hand you the microphone. All right.
Right here.
Sir, earlier you said it was a rhetorical question. You said, but why are they doing this? Why are they doing all these things that we've seen through history? And the answer is very simple, and it's a one-word answer: power. Everything that has been done is about getting power, maintaining that power, or trying to get the power that they've lost. That's what I would put down in an essay, and I hope that you would grade me very well for that.
Well, it looks like we're going to have a lot of fun sharing a class this semester. I would disagree. What I've been talking about is not gaining power, but gaining basic rights. Now, that in and of itself is power. Each and every one of us exercises our power within society, right? But, go ahead.
I'm sorry, no. I'm talking about on the other side.
Go ahead.
The people that were lynching, the ones that were doing all the nasty bad things. That's what I'm saying. You asked a question earlier.
Yeah.
You said, why are they doing these things?
Yeah.
Why
Yeah.
did they take a postcard? I mean, take the picture. Why did they do these things? That's what I'm referring to is for power.
I see your point.
Now do I get that A on the test?
Might have to be a little longer than this session. Look, I think there are noble reasons to want power. So I'm not going to argue with people who want to win political power. I should acknowledge you're taking a history class with me. I'm a political scientist. The power in politics can be used for ill or for good, and people who want power to make positive change and to ensure the basic dignities of not even just our constitutional order, but the international rights that we've signed on to. That requires power to prevent people that I think you're referencing who want to maintain power by undermining basic rights. So I think we're in agreement. Okay.
Anybody else?
Now you get the A.
So like the key role of the church in the civil rights movement, how do you feel that they could play a key role in today's racial landscape?
In today's racial landscape?
Yeah, what could they do now, like in the ways that they have before, like the reaction of the Birmingham letter, for example?
Well, tonight we will host the community celebration, and we've hosted that for about almost a decade. But before coming to Viterbo, it was at English Lutheran Church. When Pastor Mark Solist, I was in a meeting with him and arguing, hey, we should have it here at Viterbo. We've got a bigger venue. We've got some resources to get speakers. I mean, the celebration had gotten so bad that they had to invite me to be their speaker. And, they were in dire straits at that moment. That one church, I think, is doing it. I think the Roman Catholic Church is a big, dispersed institutional apparatus, but I think through the vehicle of Viterbo University and the Franciscan Foundation from the sisters across the street from us, I think this institution is making a serious attempt at contributing to, I'll just call it improving race relations. So I know that there are conservative, evangelical, fundamentalist Christian churches that might not be on board with that sort of thing. But Christianity itself is such an old, long-lasting institutional apparatus that, well, of course, slave holders would justify their slavery by referencing the Old Testament. My experience with religiosity is here at Viterbo, and I'm not only humbled, but also deeply proud to be a part of this institution and be a small part of some of the things that are going on here that are trying to address these issues. I hope that helps. Thanks.
Got space for one more question?
I was just going to chat as something piece of interest. The question on race and power is actually a fascinating one that has, I think, as me and Keith both know, has galvanized historical questions for generations. The question, for instance, up into the Civil War, it's an old debate, but historians have struggled with it. The idea of for the South, was slavery economically beneficial, or was it a system, especially for the South, that was itself struggling to keep up with the North? And so was this system, this implies itself, something that helped enforce power, or was it a legacy of a backward system that was more cultural in nature. But I won't get into the nitty-gritty of the debates, but this has been applied to many situations where we can see it sometimes that power defines these relationships. But in other instances, historians have seen the way in which this cultural phenomenon of race and thinking that somehow the amount of melanin in someone's skin should be able to define all sorts of characteristics and realities seems to be an animal into itself, whether it was originated based off of a power relationship well before that time. But I think it's a great question to ask because it reflects on the fact of the way in which race even today can reflect on both realities. It can be both cultural, it can be about power, but it can be both, and it's a very complex system that I think, as Keith says, we hope to untangle.
Well, the southern states, the slaveholding states, was that was one of the wealthiest 5 regions in the Western world prior to the Civil War. So the wealth was not distributed, of course not to slaves. They were property, even 3/5 of a person in our Constitution. But was slavery economically a positive? Absolutely. In my mind, there's no question. And what then accompanies that is, well, how do you keep a system that is so violent as slavery in place by educating people that, well, these really are only 3/5 of a human being? And that attitude became so deeply entrenched in those Confederate slaveholding states, and perhaps, having lived in Missouri, perhaps the states that didn't join the Confederacy, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, that after the Civil War, the South becomes one of the poorest regions in the Western world. And why? Excuse my language now, because it is hell-bent on constructing a system, a social as well as economic system, that is premised upon the skin color prejudice that you referenced at the end of your comment, Eric. And so it can be economically advantageous for elites, and then trickling down to some element of that slaveholding society, but then are taught crude cultural attitudes can become so powerful that I can't think of it as any other way that we become deranged, so that we're willing to diminish our own society, as the former Confederacy did for 100 years after the Civil War, to make the post-Civil War South as institutionally, culturally imposing a system of prejudice as it can. And it'd be interesting to get the comment from someone from the business school, but my view on economics is that the surest way to be economically successful is to ensure that wealth is distributed in the widest manner possible. And so, those southern elites that set up the convict leasing system and all that, it made them a lot of money, but their society was destroyed. They just didn't get over the Civil War, right? I don't know if that answers your question, Eric, but that's my view on it.
Keith, I think often when we think in economic terms about how distribution is always brought up, that's really important. If you have a really unequal society, that has a big negative impact on a lot of things, and there's moral questions there too. But I think outside of that, we think in terms of like gross domestic product per capita. There's how much economic stuff is there per person. And I suspect, I don't know if this work has been done, but I suspect that actually
Well, of course, in the southern slaveholding states, those workers who were producing the wealth weren't fully fledged human beings, so they're not in any way, shape, or form, 4 million of them, by the time we get to the Civil War, they're not in any kind of calculation. Pardon my language again. Who gives a shit about them? Practically no one. And so economic data, as we would understand it today, I think can hardly even be applied to southern slaveholding states. It's, you know, there have to be all these qualifications made.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. Let's give a round of applause for our presenter, speaker, Keith Knutson.
Thank you very much.
I just want to remind everybody about our community celebration at 7 p.m. It's going to be in the Fine Arts Main Theater. It will also be live through the Viterbo Ethics Facebook page if you cannot attend in person, but we do definitely want to see you there in person. So please feel free to go around and come back around at 7 p.m. in the Fine Arts Center. Thank you, everybody who attended and everybody online who watched these events with us today. Thanks for coming.